The bells of St. Matthew's Chapel rang out across the small South Carolina town, their solemn tones rolling over fields and dusty roads like a command. Men in coats and boots, women in bonnets and gloves, children scrubbed clean for Sunday, one by one they moved toward the chapel, as if pulled by the weight of tradition as much as by faith. The wooden pews creaked beneath familiar bodies, the hymns rose in practiced unison, and at the pulpit stood Reverend Josiah Harper, the man they called shepherd, moral guide, and chosen mouthpiece of God. He cut an imposing figure even in the sweltering August heat, his black coat crisp, his white collar spotless, his streaked hair combed neatly back. His voice carried with the conviction of thunder as he read from the book of Proverbs, every word a hammer striking sin. The borrower is servant to the lender, he thundered, the congregation murmuring assent. Debt is bondage, and bondage is sin. Faces nodded, hands clutched handkerchiefs and hats tighter, and whispers of "Amen" rippled through the hall. They believed him as they always had. Josiah Harper was the kind of man who commanded faith with his very posture, upright, steady, unbending. He had married half the town, baptized their infants, buried their dead. He had spoken over droughts and floods, offered scripture when harvests failed, delivered judgment when men faltered, and yet, behind the polished veneer of his words, Josiah's eyes flickered with something else. He glanced toward the back of the church, where his eldest daughter Ruth sat, her bonnet tilted to shield her gaze. She was 20 now, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes sharp as riverstone. Beside her sat Anna, just 16, gentler, more pliant, her hands folded as if in constant prayer. Both were dressed modestly, as a reverend's daughters should be, yet there was an undeniable tension in the air whenever Josiah's gaze lingered. They were, after all, his unspoken leverage, though the congregation did not yet know it. As the sermon ended and hymns rose, Josiah spread his arms wide. Go now, children of God, live free from the snares of sin, and let no debt chain you to the wickedness of this world. His words echoed off the wooden rafters, stirring nods and whispers of admiration. But when the service concluded and the townsfolk spilled into the sunlight, Josiah did not bask in their praise. He retreated quickly to his study in the chapel's adjoining house, where stacks of papers lay waiting, unpaid bills, promissory notes, threats from creditors written in harsh ink. He sank into his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose as sweat trickled beneath his collar. Servant to the lender, he muttered under his breath, the irony sour as bile. His debts stretched across Charleston banks and local merchants alike. He had borrowed heavily to expand his modest farm, wagering on a cotton harvest that had withered under blight. He had wagered again at cards in Savannah, trying to turn loss into fortune, but the dice had not favored him. Now every sermon he preached against bondage of debt was a dagger of hypocrisy twisting deeper into his own ribs. The knock at his door that afternoon was heavy, deliberate. Josiah stiffened before rising to answer. On the threshold stood Silas Wainwright, a plantation owner with too much money and too little patience. His smile was thin, his waistcoat stretched tight over his belly. Reverend, Silas drawled, tipping his hat. Fine words this morning, mighty fine. I came to collect on the other words, those written in ink, you recall. Josiah's jaw clenched. It is Sunday, Mr. Wainwright. Surely this can wait. Silas stepped inside uninvited, his boots leaving dust on the wooden floor. Debts don't rest on the Sabbath, Reverend. Neither do I. You owe me $600, and I am not a patient man. Josiah straightened, his hands clasped behind his back. I will find a way. God provides. Silas chuckled darkly. God may provide, but I deal in coin, and I hear your farms as empty as a sinner's promise. His eyes drifted toward the window where Ruth and Anna were visible in the yard, their dresses bright against the green. But perhaps you've assets more appealing than coin. The Reverend's face tightened. You will mind your tongue. I only mean, Silas said, smirking, That marriage is a fine solution to a debt. My nephew is of age, strong, healthy. A union could erase a sum or two. He let the suggestion hang in the air, heavy and vile. Josiah did not respond at once. His silence spoke louder than denial. Finally, he said, "We shall discuss terms later. Not here, not now." Silas tipped his hat again, his smirk widening. "Later then, Reverend, but don't wait too long. Fire eats wood quicker than you think." He left with the confidence of a man who knew he held another's throat in his grip. Josiah sank back into his chair, staring at the papers on his desk. The voices of his daughters floated through the window, Anna laughing at some small joke, Ruth correcting her with the sharpness of an older sister. Their innocence scraped against his conscience like grit in a wound. Yet desperation, like a serpent, coiled tighter around his soul. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the crickets began their chorus, Ruth found her father still at his desk, candlelight carving shadows across his stern face. "Papa," she said softly, setting a hand on the doorframe, "you hardly ate at supper. Is something wrong?" Josiah looked at her, really looked. She was strong, willed, bright-eyed, unwilling to bend. He thought of Silas's words, of the nephew with coin enough to save the family. His stomach churned with the weight of choice. "Nothing you need trouble yourself with, child," he said at last, though his voice trembled at the edges. "Only matters of the church." Ruth stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Then, why do you look as though the devil himself sits on your shoulder?" Josiah forced a smile, but it faltered quickly. He rose, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Trust me, Ruth. All that I do for this family, for you and Anna." She studied him, suspicion stirring in her chest, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked back into the dim hall, her shadow stretching long behind her. Josiah returned to his desk, the candle flickering low, his debts staring up at him like a jury. He pressed his palms together, whispering a prayer not of faith but of fear. Outside, the night deepened, and with it, the first cracks in the Reverend's holy facade began to widen. The following Sunday dawned with the same golden light that seemed to sanctify everything it touched. Dew clung to the grass, the air was heavy with summer sweetness, and yet there was a strange weight in the town, a murmur that hummed just beneath the hymnals and Sunday greetings. It began with looks exchanged, whispers traded behind fans, and the slight arch of an eyebrow when Reverend Josiah Harper stepped onto the chapel steps to greet his flock. He smiled as he always did, his hands outstretched in blessing, but he felt the change. Their gazes lingered too long, their responses carried hesitation. The gossip had begun. "Reverend, Mrs. Calhoun, the grocer's wife," said as she shook his hand, her voice dipped in honey but sharp underneath. "So many fine visitors you've had this week, carriages stopping by at all hours. Must be a busy time for the Lord's work." Josiah forced a polite laugh. "Indeed, Mrs. Calhoun, the Lord's work knows no clock." Her eyes flicked toward Ruth and Anna, who stood nearby, and her smile thinned. "I expect it doesn't." She moved on, leaving the Reverend with the sting of implication. Inside the chapel, Ruth noticed it too, the stairs, the whispers muffled behind hymnals. She tugged Anna's hand, guiding her to their pew. Anna's brow furrowed. "Why do they keep looking at us?" she whispered. Ruth shook her head. "Because they're small-minded, ignore them." But in her heart she knew this was not mere idle curiosity. Something had been said. Something had been seen. The sermon Josiah delivered that morning was no different from his usual thunderous style, yet he felt his voice falter at moments, as though the very walls of the chapel pressed back against him. He chose verses about obedience, about God's trials, about Abraham offering up Isaac. His words fell heavy, unsettling, and when the final hymn faded, the silence that followed was sharper than applause. Afterward, as parishioners filed out, Ruth overheard two men muttering by the door. "Silas Wainwright was seen at the Reverend's house again, near midnight this week." One said, "And didn't you hear? The Reverend's farm is near ruined, cotton gone to rot." "God forgive me." The other replied, "But it smells of desperation, and when a man grows desperate, he'll sell anything." Ruth pulled Anna away before more could be said, her jaw tight, her hands trembling. That night, she confronted her father at supper. "Why does Mr. Wainwright visit so often?" she asked suddenly, her fork clattering against the plate. Josiah froze, his knife hovering over the roast. Anna glanced nervously between them. "Business," Josiah said flatly. "What kind of business keeps him lingering outside our window until the candles burn down?" Ruth pressed, her voice sharp. "What kind of business has the whole town whispering?" Josiah set the knife down with a thud. His eyes, stern as iron, fixed on her. "You will not question me at this table." Ruth did not back down. "If you won't answer me, the town already will. Do you know what they say, Father? They say you'd barter us away to pay your debts. They say you'd enough." Josiah roared, slamming his hand against the table. Anna gasped, her eyes filling with tears. Ruth flinched but held his gaze unyielding. Josiah's chest heaved. The silence stretched until at last he muttered, his voice ragged, "All that I do to protect this family, to keep this house standing, to keep the wolves from our door. You cannot understand the burden that rests upon me." Ruth's voice softened, though her words cut deep. "Then let us bear it with you. Do not make choices for us in secret. We are not children." But Josiah said nothing more. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor, and left them in silence. The days that followed only sharpened the whispers. Parishioners saw Josiah meeting with more than one man of means, traders, creditors, plantation heirs. Some swore they saw ledgers exchanged, papers signed, hands shaken too tightly. The Reverend's study door remained locked most nights, candlelight glowing beneath the crack until dawn. In town, the gossip curdled. Women whispered as they sorted flour in the mercantile, men muttered at the tavern, and children carried tales they barely understood. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Calhoun hissed to a neighbor. "He's promised Anna to that Wainwright boy, a cruel one, they say, always drunk, always gambling." "No," the neighbor gasped, hand at her chest. "She's but a child still, child or not." Mrs. Calhoun said, "The Reverend will do what he must. He speaks of bondage and sin on Sunday, yet what greater sin than chaining one's daughter to a brute?" By the third week, Ruth could hardly stand to leave the house without feeling eyes follow her every step. She returned one afternoon from the market, cheeks burning, fists clenched. "They are talking about us as though we're livestock." She spat to Anna, "As though we have no say in our lives." Anna, quieter, more frightened, wrung her hands. "Maybe Father is only trying to keep us safe." "Safe?" Ruth snapped, "from hunger perhaps, but not from misery. If he gives you to Silas's nephew, there will be no safety in that house, only chains you can't see." Anna's eyes filled with tears, and Ruth pulled her into an embrace, fierce and protective. "I won't let him," she whispered into her sister's hair. "I won't let him trade you like a coin." That night, long after the candles were blown out and the house lay quiet, Josiah sat alone at his desk. The papers before him blurred in the dim light, debt upon debt, threat upon threat. Silas's smirk still lingered in his mind, the sneering promise of salvation through marriage. His hands trembled as he pressed them together, whispering again what he once believed were prayers. But the words that tumbled from his lips were hollow now, more bargaining than faith. "Lord, show me a way, show me a path where I do not lose all." The only answer was the creak of the house settling in the night, the faint sound of his daughter's breathing in the rooms above, and the echo of whispers that seemed to seep through the very walls. In the chapel pews, the town's gossip was no longer whispers. It was prophecy. The Reverend's fall had begun, and everyone sensed it, even those who loved him most. The summer air grew heavier with each passing day, thick with humidity and thick with the unspoken tension that clung to the Harper household. The Reverend rose each morning to tend his sermons and his debts alike, pacing the floor of his study as though walking between two altars, one to God, the other to the men who held his notes of credit. He had once believed those paths could run together, but now he felt them pulling in opposite directions, tearing him in half. It was in early September when Josiah at last let his desperation take form. Silas Wainwright's words had burrowed into him like rot. The offer of a marriage union for Anna was vulgar, yet alluring in its simplicity. To bind his daughter to a wealthy family was to bind himself to security. The numbers inked on paper would vanish. The land might be salvaged. The creditor's fists would unclench. That evening, he summoned Anna to his study, the flicker of candlelight throwing long shadows across his face. She entered timidly, her hands folded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Sit, child," Josiah said softly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as though ready to flee. "There are matters I must speak to you about," he began, "matters of duty, matters of family." Anna nodded, though her throat tightened. She had seen his unease in recent weeks, felt the weight of whispers pressing on her shoulders, and she dreaded what would follow. "Silas Wainwright has approached me," Josiah continued, his fingers steepled before him. "His nephew, Henry, is in need of a wife, a good wife, a pious wife. He is a man of means, Anna, strong, established, capable of providing not only for you, but for this family. It is an honorable match." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had seen Henry Wainwright once at a market, his laugh crude, his manner rough, his eyes wandering where they should not. A shiver ran through her. "Papa," she whispered finally, "I do not wish it." Josiah's eyes hardened, though his voice remained calm. "It is not for you to wish. It is for you to obey. The Lord sets us upon paths we may not choose, but we must walk them with faith." Anna shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "The Lord did not make me for Henry Wainwright." Her defiance startled him, and for a moment he saw Ruth in her expression. The same fire, the same refusal to bend. He slammed his hand upon the desk, the papers trembling. "You will not question me in this, Anna. Do you understand? This is the only way to preserve what is ours, to save us all." Her tears spilled over, and she rose abruptly, fleeing the study without another word. Josiah sank back into his chair, pressing his face into his hands. He told himself it was for her good, for all their good, but even as he whispered those justifications, the words tasted of ash. Ruth found Anna weeping in their shared bedroom, her sobs muffled against the quilt. Ruth's jaw tightened as she pried the truth from her sister, every word fueling the fire already smoldering inside her. "He cannot do this," Ruth hissed. "He cannot trade you like cattle." Anna's voice broke. "He says it is to save us. He says it is duty." Ruth pulled her close, fury and love mingling in equal measure. "No, he says it is God's will when it is only his pride and his debts. I won't let him. I swear it." The next morning, Ruth confronted her father, not in private but in the kitchen where Anna and the housekeeper could hear. "You would give Anna to Henry Wainwright?" she demanded, her voice sharp as steel. Josiah's face flushed. "I will not be spoken to in this manner. You speak of duty and God, but what of love? What of her soul? Henry Wainwright is a brute. You know it." Josiah's jaw worked as he struggled for control. "You think yourself wiser than me, than the man God has placed as head of this house. You would see us ruined rather than bend to his design." Ruth stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "I would see us honest. I would see Anna free. If ruin comes, better that than selling her to a drunkard for your debts." The housekeeper gasped softly, clutching her apron, while Anna stood trembling in the doorway. Josiah's hand rose as though to strike, but he froze, trembling, and let it fall. He turned away, his breath ragged. "You know nothing of the world," he muttered. "You know nothing of the burdens a man bears." He stormed from the room, leaving the silence heavy in his wake. But Ruth knew more than he thought. She had her own heart entangled, her own secret hopes. A young farmhand named Samuel, broad-shouldered and kind, had caught her affections long ago. Their meetings by the river, their whispered words beneath the magnolia trees, were treasures she guarded against the suffocating piety of her father's house. To see Anna bartered away was unbearable, but to imagine her own fate tied to such bargains was unthinkable. She found Samuel that evening, her voice trembling as she poured out the story. He listened, his hands clenching into fists, his brow furrowed with anger. "He cannot force her," Samuel said firmly. "The law may favor him, but she has her will, and you will not let this stand. I know you." Ruth's eyes glistened. "But what power have we? He is the Reverend. The town bows to him even as they whisper." "Then let them whisper louder," Samuel replied. "Truth has a way of breaking through, and if it doesn't, then we will find our own way." Their fingers intertwined, a fragile promise in the dark. Yet Ruth knew promises were brittle things when weighed against the iron of her father's determination. The next weeks were a tangle of unease. Anna avoided her father, moving through the house like a ghost. Ruth grew sharper in her defiance, questioning Josiah's every word, every sermon, every late-night meeting with creditors. And Josiah himself unraveled bit by bit, his voice in the pulpit less steady, his eyes darting toward the congregation as though he could hear their thoughts. One Sunday, as he preached of Abraham's faith and Isaac's sacrifice, a baby wailed in the back pew, and the congregation tittered nervously. Josiah's hands shook as he gripped the pulpit, his voice cracking as he thundered, "Would you deny God what he demands? Would you deny duty, even if it meant your own child upon the altar?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Mothers pulled their children close, men shifted uncomfortably. Ruth felt her stomach twist. The Reverend's desperation was no longer hidden, it blazed for all to see. That evening whispers spread like wildfire through the town. The Reverend was losing his grip. The Reverend spoke of sacrifice too easily. The Reverend was ready to trade blood for coin. And Ruth knew then that the plan her father clung to was already unraveling, not just in their home, but in the eyes of every soul who had once called him a man of God. The air in the Harper household seemed to thicken with every passing day, as if even the walls themselves sensed the pressure mounting within them. Anna avoided her father's gaze. Ruth's anger flared at the smallest word, and Josiah carried himself with a brittle dignity that cracked whenever silence stretched too long. Each supper was a battlefield of unspoken things, every prayer before the meal heavy with what went unsaid. It was a Thursday evening, near dusk, when Josiah returned from town with his jaw set and his eyes burning with the fever of decision. He had spent the afternoon with Silas Wainwright, the terms laid out before him like scripture he could not escape. The nephew Henry had agreed. The creditors would hold their dogs at bay. A match, a marriage, and the Harpers' debts would be smothered under the weight of new alliance. He called for Anna in the parlor, the light of the setting sun painting the room in shades of red and gold. She entered hesitantly, Ruth trailing behind her like a shadow, unwilling to let her sister face him alone. Josiah cleared his throat, his voice solemn, almost ceremonial. "Anna, Ruth, I have made arrangements. Tomorrow evening, Henry Wainwright and his uncle will come to this house. It is agreed. Anna will be betrothed to Henry. The banns will be announced Sunday." Anna froze, her breath catching. Ruth's sharp intake of air broke the silence, followed by an outraged cry. "You cannot mean this. You promised no such thing without our voices, without her voice." Josiah's eyes flicked toward her, hard and unyielding. "I promised nothing to you, Ruth. I act as father and guardian. This is decided." Anna's knees nearly gave beneath her. "Papa, please, I cannot." Her words dissolved into a whisper, her face pale. "Enough," Josiah snapped, though his own voice quivered. "The matter is closed. You will honor this union, Anna. It is God's will. It is for the salvation of this house." Ruth stepped forward, her fists clenched. "God's will? You dare to dress your debts in holy words. This is not salvation. It is betrayal, betrayal of Anna, of us, of everything you preach from that pulpit." The Reverend's face flushed crimson, his hand trembling against the arm of his chair. "You will not speak to me in such a manner. You are blinded by youthful pride, Ruth. One day you will understand the sacrifices required of us." But Ruth did not waver. She pulled Anna into her arms, holding her trembling sister as though shielding her from the decree that had just been pronounced. "If you force this, Father, then you will lose us both." For the first time, Josiah faltered. His eyes flickered with something like fear or shame or perhaps only exhaustion, but he did not withdraw his words. Instead, he rose and left the room, the slam of the study door sealing his decision. The following evening came too swiftly. The Wainwright carriage pulled up the Harper Drive, its lanterns glowing like predatory eyes in the twilight. Henry stepped down first, tall but heavy around the middle, his hair slicked back, his smile too wide and wet. He smelled faintly of liquor even in the open air. Silas followed, smug as ever, his presence filling the doorway as though he were already master of the house. Anna sat stiffly in the parlor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face drained of color. Ruth stood behind her, her chin high, glaring at Henry with all the fury she could muster. The formalities passed like a funeral procession. Josiah offered tea, spoke of family and duty, praised Henry's prospects, all while Ruth's silence seethed like a storm. At last Silas produced a folded paper, setting it on the table with a flourish. "The terms," he said smoothly, "engagement to be announced, dowry forgiven, debts erased. A binding arrangement, Reverend. Once you sign, there is no turning back." Josiah's hand hovered over the quill. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the silence of the room broken only by the ticking of the clock. He thought of sermons preached, of the gaze of his congregation, of the hollow echo of his prayers. He thought of the fields gone fallow, the creditor's threats, the humiliation of ruin, and then he thought of Anna's tears, of Ruth's defiance, of his wife, long gone to the grave, who once reminded him that daughters were blessings, not possessions. For a heartbeat he faltered, but desperation is a merciless master. His hand tightened, and with a flourish he signed. Anna's soft gasp cut through the air. Ruth's cry followed, fierce and unyielding. "You've damned us, Father." Henry only grinned, leaning back with satisfaction. Silas folded the paper neatly, his eyes gleaming. "A wise decision, Reverend. You'll sleep easier now." But Josiah did not sleep easier that night. He sat in his study long after the Wainwrights' carriage had rattled away, staring at the ink drying on the page. The house was silent, save for the muffled sound of Anna's sobs upstairs and Ruth's pacing footsteps. He pressed his face into his hands, whispering prayers that sounded more like curses. In town, word spread with astonishing speed. By morning, it seemed every corner of the market buzzed with the news. The Reverend's daughter promised to Henry Wainwright, one woman said, shaking her head, sold off like a debt's coin. Mark my words. Another replied, this is the beginning of his ruin. No sermon can wash this clean. By Sunday, the pews of St. Matthew's were packed with more faces than usual, not for worship but for spectacle. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, announcing the engagement with forced solemnity, his voice echoing against rafters that now seemed to mock him. Anna sat rigid, her face pale as marble. Ruth did not bow her head for the prayer. She stared at her father, her eyes unblinking, her defiance blazing bright enough to scorch him. The whispers in the pews were no longer whispers. They were accusations carried on every breath. And as Josiah closed the service, he felt the sanctuary closing in on him, not a house of God but a tribunal, each face a silent judge. That night, Ruth cornered him once more. "You've betrayed her," she said, her voice cold, final, "and you've betrayed me. I swear to you, Father, I will not stand by and watch you trade away our lives. Whatever power you think you hold, it is already crumbling, and soon even your pulpit won't save you." Josiah stared at her, weary beyond words, but in his heart He knew she was right. The ink on the engagement paper was dry, but so too was the well of faith he had once drawn from. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if God still listened at all. The morning of the sermon dawned heavy with clouds, the kind that promised neither rain nor relief, only an oppressive weight pressing down upon the town. St. Matthew's Chapel had never felt so full. Word of Anna Harper's betrothal had spread like fire through dry brush, drawing not only the faithful but also the curious. The pews groaned beneath the crowd, faces pressed close, fans fluttering like restless wings, voices hushed but charged with anticipation. At the pulpit, Josiah Harper stood rigid, his Bible open but his hands trembling upon it. He had delivered countless sermons from that very place, his words once met with reverence, his presence commanding. But now, as he looked over the sea of faces, he felt no reverence, only judgment. Every eye seemed to pierce him, every whispered breath to carry accusation. Anna sat near the front, her face pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Henry Wainwright loomed at her side, smug in his new claim, his fingers tapping idly on his knee as if already bored with his prize. Ruth sat behind them, her chin raised defiantly, her eyes fixed upon her father with unflinching intensity. Josiah cleared his throat, his voice catching at first before rising in its familiar cadence. Brothers and sisters, we gather today in the house of the Lord to speak of faith, of sacrifice, of obedience to God's holy will. A murmur rippled through the pews. The words were familiar, yet now they seemed hollow, almost grotesque. Josiah pressed on, his voice growing louder, harsher. Did not Abraham lay Isaac upon the altar, willing to surrender his beloved child to God's command? And did not God, in his mercy, provide a ram in place of the boy? This is faith. This is obedience, to give even that which we love most dearly, to trust in his plan above our own desires. His fist struck the pulpit, the sound echoing through the chapel like a gunshot. Anna flinched, Ruth's lips pressed thin, and the congregation stirred uneasily. From the back, a voice called out, a man's voice, bold and sharp. And what of a father who sacrifices not to God, but to his creditors? Tell us, Reverend, where in the good book does it say a daughter must be bartered for a debt? The words cut through the air, and a shiver passed through the crowd. Josiah's face flushed, his breath caught. He scanned the faces before him, but no one moved, no one claimed the words. The whisper had become a roar, and it was everywhere. He raised his hands, his voice trembling with both fury and desperation. You dare to question me in God's house. I am his servant, chosen to guide you, to bear the burden of this flock. But Ruth's voice rose clear above the murmur, strong and fearless. You bear only the burden of your pride, Father. Do not cloak your sins in God's name. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Josiah's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing, but Ruth did not falter. She stood, her presence commanding in its own right, her gaze unwavering. You preach of sacrifice, yet it is not your flesh upon the altar, but Anna's. You preach of obedience, yet it is not obedience to God you demand, but obedience to your debts. You are no shepherd, you are a wolf among your flock. The chapel erupted into chaos. Some cried out in outrage, others in defense, still others in whispers that buzzed like wasps. Anna sat frozen, her eyes wide with tears, her lips trembling. Henry shifted uncomfortably, his smugness faltering under the weight of so many eyes. Josiah gripped the pulpit until his knuckles whitened, his body trembling with rage. Silence, he thundered, his voice cracking. This is my house, my pulpit. I will not be judged by children nor by gossips. But the authority he once wielded had slipped from his grasp. The congregation no longer bowed to his words. They stared, their eyes sharp, their whispers venomous. The illusion of holiness shattered, leaving only a desperate man clinging to power. Josiah stumbled from the pulpit, his Bible falling to the floor with a dull thud. He strode down the aisle, his robes trailing, his face pale as death. Parishioners drew back as he passed, some in shock, others in quiet contempt. Ruth remained standing, her hands clenched, her breath unsteady, but her gaze still fixed on him. Outside, the air felt no cooler, heavy with tension and storm. Josiah leaned against the chapel wall, his chest heaving. He could still hear the murmurs inside, the words he could not silence. Hypocrite, wolf, devil in the pulpit. He pressed his hand to his brow, his heart pounding like a drum. His world, once so ordered, so certain, was unraveling faster than he could bind it. His congregation no longer trusted him. His daughters no longer obeyed him. His debts still loomed like vultures overhead. From the corner of his eye, he saw Ruth emerge from the chapel, Anna clinging weakly to her side. Ruth's gaze met his sharp and unyielding, and for a moment, father and daughter stood locked in silent battle. Then she turned away, leading Anna down the road without a word. Josiah watched them go, his hands trembling, his lips moving in a prayer that no longer carried weight. He had once believed his voice could call down heaven, but now it echoed only against the walls of his own guilt. Inside the chapel, his Bible lay where it had fallen, pages fluttering in the draft. The Word of God remained, but the man who claimed it was crumbling, and the town, once his faithful flock, had seen the devil standing in the pulpit. The night after the sermon hung heavy and unnatural, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp soil, yet carrying a current of unease that settled over Harper land like a shroud. The house itself seemed restless, the shutters creaking in the wind, the timbers groaning as if bearing witness to its master's disgrace. Josiah Harper sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands clutching a cup of whiskey he had no taste for. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his lips murmuring words of prayer that never rose above a whisper. The echoes of Ruth's accusation still thundered in his ears, drowning even the sound of cicadas outside. He had felt stripped bare in front of the congregation, his authority shredded by the daughter he could neither control nor silence. The voices in the chapel had not been hushed. They had not been quick to forgive. He had seen it in their eyes: contempt, pity, disgust. Some had even dared to meet his gaze with satisfaction, as if relishing his downfall. The door creaked open. Anna slipped inside, her movements ghost-like, her eyes red from weeping. She did not look at her father as she fetched a pitcher of water, her hands trembling so violently that she nearly dropped it. Josiah turned toward her, his mouth opening, but no words came. What could he say? She too had seen him fall. She too carried the weight of his choices. Go to bed, he muttered at last, his voice hoarse. She obeyed without protest, vanishing into the shadowed hallway. Josiah remained in the kitchen long after the lamps had burned low. At last, when the whiskey could no longer numb his thoughts, he rose and stumbled outside. The moon cast a thin silver light upon the fields. Once they had been his pride, rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, men and women laboring under the Carolina sun. Now they lay fallow, untended, the soil exhausted, the laborers gone to richer lands, debts piled where bounty once grew, and creditors circled like wolves around a limping stag. From the road came the sound of hooves and wheels. Josiah stiffened, his heart lurching. A wagon creaked into view, lanterns swinging at its sides. 3 men dismounted, their coats heavy, their boots grinding into the dust. Josiah recognized them instantly, Wainwright's agents, sent not with greetings but with reminders of the debt still unpaid. Reverend Harper, the tallest man, drawled, his voice thick with contempt. You've been granted patience, but patience runs thin. Mr. Wainwright expects what is owed. The girl's hand is one thing, but money remains another. Josiah's fists clenched, rage and shame warring within him. You tell your master his demands are met. My daughter is promised. Soon she will be wed, and your ledger satisfied. The man's lip curled. Promises don't pay debts, Reverend. Wainwright expects coin, not excuses. They left him there, standing in the moonlight, their words like brands seared upon his mind. When the wagon rattled away, Josiah staggered back toward the house, but before he reached the porch, the scent of smoke hit his nostrils. At first it was faint, a whisper in the night, then stronger, thicker, choking. He spun toward the barn, and his stomach dropped. Flames licked the wooden slats, orange and hungry, already devouring the dry timbers. Sparks leapt skyward, carried by the wind, drifting toward the parched fields. "Fire!" Josiah roared, his voice cracking. "Fire!" Ruth burst from the house, her nightdress whipping around her, her hair unbound. Anna followed, her face stricken with terror. Together they stood frozen, staring at the inferno consuming the barn, the blaze roaring like a beast unleashed. "Fetch water," Josiah bellowed, but already he knew it was useless. Flames had taken hold too quickly, too fiercely. The roof caved in with a crash, sparks scattering across the yard. Neighbors arrived with buckets, drawn by the glow that painted the sky, but their efforts faltered. The barn collapsed into a pillar of sparks, and the fire leapt to the nearest field, setting dry stalks ablaze. The wind carried embers across the land, igniting patches that spread like wildfire. Shouts filled the night, men cursing, women crying, children wailing as the fire spread its cruel fingers across the Reverend's domain. Josiah fought like a madman, hauling buckets, shouting orders, his face streaked with soot and sweat. But the land turned against him. His neighbors looked on with grim faces, their efforts half-hearted. They knew his sins, his debts, his disgrace. Their arms moved, but their hearts did not. Ruth coughed violently, pulling Anna back from the heat. Her eyes, red and fierce, turned toward her father. "This is the Lord's judgment," she shouted over the roar. "Fire for lies, ash for sin." Josiah staggered, her words striking harder than any flame. Around him, everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, turned to cinders. The barn, the fields, the tools of his livelihood, all swallowed by fire. The land that had once made him proud now mocked him in its destruction. By dawn, only smoldering ruins remained. The barn was a blackened skeleton, the fields a scar of ash. Exhausted neighbors drifted away, murmuring to one another in tones that carried more scorn than pity. Josiah stood in the gray morning light, his clothes singed, his hands blistered, his spirit broken. Anna clung to Ruth, her sobs muffled against her sister's shoulder. Ruth's gaze never left him, steady and merciless. He looked upon the ruin of his land, his debtors still circling, his daughters slipping from his grasp, his congregation lost. Smoke curled upward, twisting into the sky like a black prayer. For the first time, Josiah Harper wondered if God had turned his face away. And if so, what was left for a man whose name was ash upon the wind? The fire had taken more than wood and fields. It had taken the last illusions Josiah Harper clung to. In the days that followed, the house stood surrounded by blackened earth, a lone shell upon land stripped bare. The barn was gone, the crops were gone, the labor gone, and with them any hope of repayment. The Reverend had nothing left but a ruin that smelled of smoke and shame. The creditors came swiftly. Wainwright's agents returned with papers in hand, their boots grinding ash into the porch planks as they posted notices of forfeiture. The land, once his father's pride and his inheritance, was no longer his. It would pass into the hands of men who measured worth in coin and acres, not in scripture or sermon. Josiah tried to argue, to bargain, but his voice cracked, his words feeble. Even the law, which had once turned to him for blessing, now regarded him with cold indifference. The congregation of St. Matthew's turned away as well. On Sunday, when Josiah attempted to ascend the pulpit once more, he found the church doors locked. The keys were no longer his. A younger minister, brought in from Charleston, stood in his place the following week, preaching to the same people who had once called Josiah their shepherd. They listened now with eagerness, as though glad to be freed from the weight of hypocrisy. At home, Ruth moved quietly, tending to Anna, packing small bundles of belongings, her eyes always averted when her father entered the room. She spoke little, but her silence was sharper than any accusation. Josiah tried to reach her, to demand obedience, but the words withered on his tongue. He no longer carried the weight of authority, only the hollow echo of it. One evening, as cicadas sang their endless dirge, Ruth appeared before him, her hand clasped firmly around Anna's. "We're leaving," she said simply. Josiah looked up from his Bible, though the pages had long blurred into meaningless lines. Leaving, where will you go? Anywhere but here, Ruth replied. I will not see Anna shackled to Wainwright's son. I will not live in the shadow of your debts or your lies. There are kin in Charleston who will take us in, perhaps further still, if the Lord opens the way. He stared at her, his mouth dry. You would abandon me, your father. Ruth's gaze was steady, unflinching. You abandoned us first when you chose pride over love, debt over truth. You are not the man you pretend to be. You are not the man God called you to be. Anna wept softly beside her, torn between fear and relief. Josiah reached out a trembling hand, but Ruth drew her sister back, out of his reach. Without another word, she led Anna to the door. Their footsteps faded into the night, leaving him alone with the creaking timbers and the lingering smell of smoke. Days turned into weeks. The house grew quieter, emptier. The neighbors avoided him on the road, turning their heads as he passed. Children whispered devil in the pulpit, behind their hands. He preached no more, tended no land, heard no voices in prayer. At last the sheriff came with men to clear the house. Josiah watched in silence as his few possessions were carried out, his Bible among them. The house was shuttered, the locks changed, the land handed over. He stood in the road, a small bundle of clothes in his arms, as the world he had known disappeared behind nailed boards. The months that followed blurred together. He wandered from parish to parish, seeking work, seeking forgiveness, but none would take him. His name carried faster than his footsteps. Some nights he slept beneath church porches, others in barns offered by pitying farmers. Hunger hollowed his cheeks, loneliness bent his back. The man who had once thundered from the pulpit now whispered prayers to empty air, begging for a God who no longer answered. Years later, when news of him reached Charleston, it was said he had been found in a small coastal town, slumped on the steps of a chapel, his body thin, his hair turned white too soon. No family stood beside him, no congregation claimed him. The man once called Reverend lay buried in an unmarked grave, the soil covering him as the fire had once covered his land. Ruth and Anna, meanwhile, survived. Ruth, fierce and unyielding, found work as a seamstress in Charleston, and later married a dockhand who loved her for her strength rather than her dowry. Anna, gentler but stronger than her father knew, learned to read and write under Ruth's guidance, her sorrow slowly giving way to resilience. Together, they built a life free from the shadow of Josiah's choices, their names untainted by his ruin, and so it was that the Harper legacy ended not in glory, nor in the righteous light Josiah had once preached, but in silence, ash, and absence. The Reverend who had sought to rule by God's word left only a trail of ruin and the bitter lesson that faith, twisted by pride, becomes its own destruction. The chapel bells in St. Matthew's rang on, Sunday after Sunday, but for Josiah Harper there was no flock, no altar, no forgiveness. Only the widowhood of disgrace alone, forgotten, and buried beneath the ashes of his own making, like the channel subscribed to ritual of fear.